morning, Crossing Church. It is good to be with you. And if you're joining us, what's up? If you're joining us live on Facebook, good to see you as well. Hi, Mom. I'm excited to be here. I got a fresh marker and a fresh pad of paper, so you know we're going to have some fun together. I got a phone call Wednesday night about 6 p.m. from Pastor Brian, and as he explained, he said, our flight's been rearranged because of the coming snow, and I need you to preach this weekend. I'm not going to be there. Now, I knew this was April Fool's Day weekend, and so I said, yeah, right. But he persisted. He said, no, really, I promise you this is not a joke. I need you to preach really last minute. I'm not going to get in till late Saturday now, maybe early Sunday, and I won't be able to do it. And like anybody in this situation would do, I made him send me his flight information. And he did. And sure enough, it wasn't an April Fool's prank. His flight had been rerouted. But you got to double check, because if there's anybody in the world that deserves a prank of this level, it would be me. It happens to be one of my favorite holidays of the year, which I understand is weird for a pastor to say 2 weeks from Easter. But April 1st is kind of a family holiday. It was my dad's birthday, and so growing up, we always pulled little pranks on him, from a rubber band around the faucet on the sinks, just soaking wet after he turns it on to wash his hands, to decorating a cardboard box to look like a cake. And when you're 7 years old, that's hilarious, trust me. But as we got older and we learned more about how things work, we were able to put a little bit compressed air in the cake so that as he went to cut it, that's funny no matter how old you are, I promise. It was almost my daughter's birthday. In fact, that was my prayer all along, but we missed it by about 8 to 9 hours. Today is actually her birthday. She turns 2. I have to leave here to go to a giant Sesame Street party. So if anybody is wondering if I can tell you how to get to Sesame Street, I can. It's just down 104. And I just love to pull pranks. A few years ago, found a nice big air horn and duct taped it to the bottom of Pastor Brian's office chair. Luckily, we didn't videotape his response, but you can imagine. I think it was the next year I broke into his computer, because his password is super secure, and I changed his autocorrect settings. So every time he signed his name, every time the word Brian was typed, it would autocorrect to Big Papa B. So if anybody received an email from Big Papa B over the years, you're welcome. And I don't know if he's discovered this one yet, but a few weeks ago, he does not preach with his iPhone in his pocket, and I happen to know where he keeps it. And if you ask Siri to call you by any name you want, she will. And so either he doesn't know or doesn't use Siri very often, or he's just very happy that Siri is now calling him Big Sexy all the time. Yeah. So like I said, if there was anybody in the world that deserved to be told that he was preaching last minute and it was an April Fool's Day joke, it was me. But it was not a joke unless this was an elaborate prank on you guys, and this is the April Fool's for you. This happened to hear me preach instead, so you're welcome. But I am excited to talk about the Apostle Peter. We're continuing our series called Encounters. Started a few weeks ago when Pastor Brian talked about Judas. Last week, Pastor Chris introduced us to the encounter with Pontius Pilate, and this week we get to talk about the Apostle Peter. And if you've been around the church at all, and probably if you didn't grow up around the church, you at least know a story or two that involve the Apostle Peter. If you didn't grow up in church at all, maybe you're far from church, this is your first time in, maybe you were drug here, and quite honestly, you think everything we do is just not worth it, but we still thank you for being here, and we're glad you're here. And I hope maybe even from that story, you can take something home with it as well, because I think it's a beautiful story that speaks to all of us wherever we are on that continuum of faith. If you know the stories, the Apostle Peter's the guy that, as Jesus was walking on the water, Jesus invited out of the boat, and he took a step, and took another step and then lost faith and sunk. He's also the guy that in the Garden of Gethsemane, as the guards were coming to arrest Jesus, drew his sword and swiped at a guard and cut his ear off. A little brash, full of action, ready to go. He's also the guy that Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, let's put that up on the screen here. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus talking to Peter says, "Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." So even with the lack of faith, even with his brash actions trying to defend Jesus, whom I think we know doesn't need defended quite in that manner, he is the guy that Jesus decided, you will be the one in charge as I leave this place. You're the one that's going to be running the church. And the one thing I think that the gospel stories do when they're talking about Peter, one of the things they show us that I think we can all identify with is they make no attempt to gloss over the fact that he's human, which means he's broken. And I think we can identify with that. We all feel that way. Even my friends far from faith, my atheist friends, would say there is something that says there's something wrong with this. Something needs fixed. Now, those of us with faith know what that is, or we would say that's God, that's our faith, that's our trust in Jesus, that's what we're moving towards. But even those that don't believe would say that there's something broken about this whole thing we call the human existence, we call life. And I think that's where we can identify with this character and this encounter with Jesus, with Peter. He's not so different from you and I. In fact, there's one, maybe I connect a little too much with him here. There's one story in the Gospel of John where Jesus is getting down to wash his disciples' feet. And Peter basically goes, "Don't you touch my feet." Which I get, because my wife doesn't touch my feet, and now that I have a 2-year-old daughter, it's very hard to describe to the Department of Children's Services why she has a black eye, because you kicked her in the face on accident because she touched your feet. Like, it's just don't. So like Peter and I were like right here. He's also the guy, even though Jesus said, you're going to be the one leading this church, basically denied Jesus in front of people over and over and over. And let's pick up that story. That's where we're going to start today in the Gospel of John. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. We will put it on the screens, but because of the short turnaround of this sermon, your sermon notes look very different today than they do normally. So you don't have the scripture if you don't have a Bible with you, but you can check it out up on the screens. In John chapter 13, it goes like this: "Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." That alone is probably like a whole sermon. We'll talk about that another time. Simon Peter asks, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, see, I should look at mine. And Jesus replied, "You can't go with me now, but you will follow me later." And this is where Peter, like where we see his personality a little bit. "But why can't I come now, Lord?" he asked. "I'm ready to die for you. I'm ready to go. I got you. You're my man. Whatever it takes, I'm there." Jesus answered, "Die for me? I tell you the truth, Peter. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." So we see that personality. He's ready to go. He's the guy that a little bit later pulls the sword out and slices off the ear of a guard, and Jesus puts it back on. You can just imagine like, "Oh, come on, Peter. Pop the ear back on. You're good to go, sir." Sorry. Just one of those fixed. I'm sorry. Peter's that guy. He's there. But it doesn't take long for Jesus' words to ring true. Let's pick up the story in John chapter 18. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. And the woman asked Peter, "You're not one of that man's disciples, are you?" And Peter said, No, I am not." Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. And we're going to skip a few verses and go to verse 25, where it says, "Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, 'You're not one of his disciples, are you?' He denied it. 'No, not me. I'm not.' But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off," so there's a connection here, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" And Peter again denied it. And immediately the rooster crowed. So there's this part we have to believe rings true in Peter when he hears that rooster crow. In fact, the other gospel accounts go on to say he went outside the gates and wept. He instantly knew he screwed up. He was Jesus's guy to the end. "I'm willing to die for you." Can I say he was Jesus's ride or die guy? Is that okay? Not everybody's going to get that. It's all right. It's for you at home on Facebook. No, he was the guy that was going to follow him till the ends of the earth, and just moments later says, I'm not associated with that guy. I want nothing to do with him. I have no idea who he is. So let's pick up the story just a little bit later. This is basically Easter morning is what we're describing. John chapter 20, we'll start at verse 1. "Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved." Now, it's okay to laugh at this, but do you know what's awesome, really awesome about this scripture here? We're reading the gospel account of John. John's telling the story. How does John decide to introduce himself in this story? The other one, whom Jesus loved. Like, forget about those other schmucks. Like, Jesus, there's a lot of scholarly debate on how the Gospels came to be. Was Mark written first? Matthew? Was there an outside source called Q that informed them? But almost all scholars believe that John was written much later than the other three Gospels. And there's a lot of debate as to why that might be, but I think we can clear that up pretty easily this morning. He was waiting for the other authors to pass away, because if they read his account, I mean, I'm the one that Jesus loved. Really, man? Come on. I already wrote mine. It brings that humanness, that wonderful human element to the story. So let's continue. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple, whom Jesus loved, started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He's already the disciple Jesus loves, but just so you know, he's faster than Peter. Like, in case you needed to know that. And not only did he outrun him, but he got to the tomb first, in case you were unaware of how outrunning somebody works. So the Department of Redundancy department here. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived, obviously later, and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first, just in case you forgot from 2 verses ago, also went in, and he saw and believed. Not only did he run faster, but he went in and saw the same stuff, but he got it. This Peter guy, he doesn't even know what's going on in here. It's a good thing I outran him. You know, these are the things about these stories that I think are so compelling. Like, sometimes we treat Scripture as just this dry story. It's just telling us factual information when there's this humanness to it. There's these things, like If it was me and I'm writing the story, there's going to be these little details in there of me making fun of my brother or making him look bad, which he does mostly on his own, but it's okay. But these are the things that let us know that these were real people. Doesn't matter, like he comes in the tomb, he understands, he sees, he believes, like all of a sudden, the universe is forever changed. History is now being rewritten. Heaven and earth have come together. Death has been over. Well, hold on. I ran faster than him. You know? I mean, these are death is no longer a thing we need to worry about. I'm faster than Peter. You know? These are great stories. I love it. And it just shows, again, we're all human. This is all part of it. This gives us a little bit more insight, a little bit more depth into these stories. But here's where this encounter, we have to imagine when Peter goes in, even though he didn't get it as quick as John seemed to, he still gets it. He sees the linens lying there. He sees the cloth folded over. He heard the rooster crow after he denied him. And now he realizes, maybe I really, really did screw up. This is real. And we read, actually, in the next chapter in John, this is, in my opinion, rock bottom. The disciples are fishing. They basically went back to work. Jesus is standing on the shore. They're not catching anything. And this man from the shore, they don't know it's Jesus yet, says, cast your net on the other side. And they cast it out, and they pull up a bunch of fish. And there's a quick exchange that happens, and Peter realizes that's Jesus. So what does he do? Well, if you read the King James Version, he stands up and puts his clothes back on because he was naked and jumps in and swims out and meets Jesus. I don't know what rock bottom looks like for you, but showing up to work naked might be it. Just saying, these are the moments that make this story a little bit more compelling to me. So this is real. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. This is where the encounter with Peter takes a beautiful change. In John chapter 21, this is actually like the next chapter right after the naked fishing experiment. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said. You know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. There's this beautiful moment of reconciliation between Jesus and Peter, where they're sitting on a beach, essentially having breakfast, and Jesus goes, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter, you can hear it in the words of the author, like he started to get annoyed. Why are you asking me for the third time? Oh, I get it. Because I denied you 3 times. That hurts. But this guy who denied Jesus in front of all these people, in his bones denied Jesus, in his soul said, I don't know him. Jesus says, I've got something for you to do. This guy who basically turned away, probably not the model guy you want running your church if he's going to actually ignore you and disown you in public. Jesus says, feed my sheep. I've got something for you to do. And there's this moment where you realize maybe Jesus is talking to Peter and saying, I need somebody to run this whole thing that really understands, that really gets this thing called grace. I need somebody to take this church that is being started, this movement, and run with it, that in their bones and in their souls understands what it's like to fail and to be forgiven. Because if I don't have somebody that understands grace and forgiveness, this whole thing will fall apart. When Jesus is teaching us to pray, we know it is the Lord's Prayer. There's a line in there, and this will also tell you where maybe you grew up. Forgive us our Yeah, trespasses is most common. There were a few people like, it's cool. It's all right, same thing. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In other words, forgive us in the same measure we forgive others. Jesus is saying to Peter, I need somebody who understands grace, or this whole thing will fall apart. See, what Jesus is teaching Peter, and what we can learn from this as well, is that we can either let our failures in our past define us, or we can let them refine us. We can sit there and live in those failures, or we can let them shape us, we can let them mold us, we can learn from them, and go on to do things that we probably couldn't have before. Failure is not the end of the story. In fact, I just actually read a quote this morning, because the first thing you do nowadays when you wake up is check Facebook, because everybody has Facebook, we do that. There's this beautiful quote that was so apropos. Just because you're going through hell doesn't mean you have to stay there. Our failure doesn't have to define us. It can refine us. And the other side of the coin of what this does, what it was shown to Peter and what Peter goes on to show others, is maybe you are no longer there in that hell. You're not living in that failure, but there are people who still are. And because you've been shown that grace and that forgiveness, you can go walk with them and help them through it as well. Our failures can define us, we can live there, or they can make us better. Now this is Denver's somewhat of a sports town, am I right? You guys have a football team out here, I hear? A few fans, I'm aware. Let's take, for example, football. Let's say a team doesn't make the playoffs or they don't win the Super Bowl. Ostensibly, that's considered a failure for a football organization. Now, if that team comes back the next season and does exactly the same thing they did for the last year, they're called the Cleveland Browns. It's a rebuilding decade. We'll be fine, maybe. No, but if that team comes back and they didn't make the playoffs, they got to figure out what they need to fix, what they need to change, how they can improve, how they can learn from where they failed. If the offensive line was bad and it caused a lot of issues, we got to fix that problem. Or we could stay in it and just stay with what we had. Worked so well last time. That's the Cleveland Browns motto. Or a boxer gets knocked down, loses a bout, sorry. For you boxing purists out there, there's probably 3 of you. He can either stay there, or he can get up. He can maybe lose a little weight if that's what needs, try to gain a little speed. He can refine himself so that the next time he enters that ring, he's ready to fight. It was the great theologian Alfred who once said, "Why do we fall down? To learn to pick ourselves up." For those of you that don't know, Alfred was Batman's butler, so he's not, it's good advice, but I don't know if we'd call him a theologian there. Yes. See, we can let our failures define us, or we can let them shape us and change us and make us better. Before this incident of denying Jesus, we see Peter, as we described earlier, kind of brash, outspoken, prone to action without necessarily thinking it through. And afterwards, Peter goes on to preach at Pentecost, seeing thousands saved, and becomes the first pope of the church. He let his failure refine him. He learned from it. And it was the grace extended to him that then he was then able to extend to others. The way my brain is wired is I go, okay, that's cool. Is there anything we can learn scientifically about failure that can help us out in this situation? Turns out there is. The National Institute of Education in Singapore conducted an experiment in which groups of students were taught to solve a new math problem using 2 very different methods. The first group was taught in the traditional way that most of us would understand. The teacher introduced the concept, showed the student how to solve the problem, and then let the students attempt to solve it with practice. The second group was given the problems to solve on their own first, with no introduction or demonstration of how to solve the problem until after they'd made several attempts to work it out on their own. Both groups of students ultimately did learn how to solve the problem, but it was the second group who were given a chance to try on their own first, which, by the way, none of them solved the problem on their own. They showed a significantly greater conceptual understanding of the subject and were able to transfer what they learned to novel problems better than the first group. It was the act of trying and failing that led them to a deeper understanding of their topic. Our brains do not function in an orderly, linear fashion. Instead, they fumble, bumble, guess, predict, fail, and then rinse and repeat. Our brains are uniquely wired in their ability to learn from failure. We can stay there. It's easy. We all know people who live in their failures. Let that control their lives. Let that be the driver in the seat of their car. I could fill up the rest of this paper pad with all the ways I've failed the last few years just as a husband and a father. We could stay there. But the good news for all of us is we don't have to. If you're still here, there's more to be done. There's room to move forward. And that's if there's one thing I hope we can take away today together, it's this. Is that our failure is never final. Never is. There's always room to let it grow, to let it shape, to sit in it, and let it help us become who God wants us to be. It's not easy, I'm not going to lie, but that's why you have all these people here around you. Right? Just because you're not sitting in that hell of failure doesn't mean somebody near you isn't. Somebody in your life group isn't. Somebody else in this church isn't. So maybe you're not there, but you can walk alongside someone who is and help them. That grace that you've been shown, you can now show to someone else. That's one of the most important functions of the church body, is that we are people who have been shown grace. We are a broken people. And the only way we make it out together is by making it out together. We walk with each other. See, the Japanese have this wonderful art called kintsugi, this wonderful concept called kintsugi. And Pastor Brian did talk about it a few months ago. Bonus points if you remember. But it's the belief that a broken bowl or cup that has been repaired with a little bit of gold in the cracks is actually more beautiful and more valuable for having been broken than it was before it ever was broken. With the touch of a master craftsman, these pieces of clay and pottery that had been broken apart now become more valuable, more treasured, more loved than they were beforehand. This is good news for broken people. Our failures are never final. If you're still here, there's still more to do. We serve a God of 2nd, 12, 13, 15, 28, 257. I think you get it. We serve a God of many chances. This isn't the only scriptural account of somebody who God trusts, who Jesus trusts, that screws up and it still turns into something beautiful. Maybe you remember King David in the Old Testament. If you're not around church much, the story is King David is on his roof while his troops are at war, which is that's not where a king is supposed to be. He notices a woman bathing on the building next to him and says, she looks good. Bring her over. Extramarital affair. She gets pregnant. King David tries to cover it up by having her husband killed while he's at war. isn't much later in the scriptures that we read, King David is still a man after God's own heart. Not because he did that, but because there was reconciliation and restoration. There was a prophet named Nathan that confronted him. And there were moments where he went, yeah, I know I've done wrong, but I'm not going to live there, and I'm not going to let it define me. See, maybe you're sitting somewhere today in that past failure, in that past hurt, and you need to know that Jesus is sitting just on the other side going, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? You are going to be okay. You are going to be okay. You are going to be okay. There is good news for broken people if we just allow it to be. May we begin to see ourselves as people who have been shown grace, so that we may in turn extend that grace to others. May we become people who let our failures refine us and shape us, rather than define us and hold us back. And may we begin to take our next steps not out of fear, but in the understanding that there is a God reaching out saying, do you love me? Because he does love us in our brokenness and has better things for us than we could ever imagine. And that, my friends, is good news for broken people.